Hey, welcome everyone to Homeless in San Diego. My name is Greg Angel, and joined today by a repeat guest, expert leading reporter around homelessness from the Voice of San Diego, Lisa Halverstadt.
Thanks for having me again, Greg.
Yeah, this time in person. Last
In
time
person.
we fumbled with some Zoom technology. We made it work, but this is much better. Thank you for coming up here to Escondido,
Of
and
course.
and most of all, thank you for the work that you do reporting on homelessness, lifting up the humanity of the issue and educating the community. It's been wonderful to see the Voice of San Diego celebrating, is it 20, 25 years?
20 years.
20 years. And part of that is sharing about impactful stories. And so, of course, your story about Hep A back in 2017,
hmm
and that shed light on a crisis that otherwise the community did not know about, that people were dying on the streets from a disease that was totally preventable. Your reporting saved lives there and also elevated kind of the issue of homelessness. Really a wonderful example of the good work you've been doing.
Well, thank you. I'm blessed to be able to do it.
Well, happy to have you back. Have I ever told you that your episode before was one of our highest rated episodes? Like
No,
more?
you didn't tell me that.
Yeah. So,
Wow.
so you're very popular. We're happy to have you back.
Wow. Well,
Yeah.
I'm impressed. Wow.
So you're back today for a couple things that we're going to talk about. One of them is that you have led, along with a number of other reporters from throughout the country who report on homelessness, you've led on the creation of a homelessness beat reporting guide, which I have a copy of here, and our listeners can take a look at. We'll put a link to it in the show notes. Share a little bit about why this came to be, why you thought it was necessary, and what's in the guide.
Well, so as you mentioned, I have been writing about homelessness for quite a while. It's actually been 10 years, which
Wow.
is pretty crazy. And in that time, you run into a lot of different ethical and logistical challenges that cover this topic, for reporters that cover this topic. And as I would go to events and I would just meet other reporters, a lot of times we would end up having similar conversations about those things. We would talk about, oh, is it okay to provide food to somebody? How do you handle when a source is in crisis? How do we talk about homeless people, homeless or unhoused? These issues just kept coming up. And then also, many of us would hear from reporters that were new to the beat or covering homelessness for the first time. There were a lot of similar questions about how do I safely approach a homeless camp?
Mm.
Uh, how do I even talk to homeless people? Are they going to want to talk to me? And my answer is always a resounding yes. They can't wait to talk to you, actually, as long as you're respectful. But so through those conversations over the years, I just became more and more convinced that there was a need for some sort of guide that reporters could take a look at, but also share with their editors when they're having some of these ethical quandaries to use as just kind of a roadmap. And so it's probably been almost a year or so
Mm.
now. I just started reaching out to other reporters that covered homelessness. And I said, hey, like we should get together and just talk. And maybe one of our first projects should be a guide. And ended up, working on this guide. And it's the product of about 10 reporters across the country. Blake Nelson from the San Diego Union Tribune is one of the contributors, but we have folks literally from San Diego to DC who contributed to this. And literally every person that contributed added a lot to this. So it's very much a group effort. But what we focus a lot on is just really, it's a lot about empathy and how to tell the stories of homeless people while also respecting the homeless folks that you're reporting on, and really being aware of the fact that for the reporters and editors who are working on a story, this is a story. But for this person we're reporting on, this is their life. And we have
Yeah.
to be really aware of that in the
Yeah.
process. So the guide just really goes through, best practices and suggestions for how to reflect that in our process.
I think for our listeners who may or may not be reporters, many of them not, right? I totally recommend that you take a look at the guide because I'm looking right now at the beginning of it where you talk about core principles and that readers may have prejudices or misconceptions about homelessness, and that including the voices of people with real experience can help dispel and clarify biases. That's exactly why this podcast exists. It exists specifically to lift up the voices of people with that experience. And most of our episodes feature that. About a third of our episodes are around there, kind of feature leaders like yourself who are doing the work around homelessness. But yeah, I mean, the principles that you and your colleagues have outlined are valuable, I would say, for all people who care about the issue, and especially those are people who are listening to this podcast who want to make a difference.
I would agree. I think a lot of it was interesting, going into this, we realized as we were talking about this as the group of journalists working on it, how much it really is about empathy and
Mm,
awareness of the situation that this person is in. So, for example, whether you're somebody who's reporting or you're just a community member who wants to help, and you're saying, "Hey, can you meet up with me at noon today?" Well, that meetup with you, where you may be handing them socks or interviewing them, might be keeping them from getting a meal that they can get for free at that time. So, a lot of this is just about like being aware of how what we want to do, maybe to help or to report on, will impact this person, and just, also leveling the playing field of power. Because when I'm out in the field as a journalist, or if I'm, say, talking to the mayor knows what on the record or off the record means. They know when to push back and say, I'm not going to talk to you right now. I'm not up for that. But when I'm out in the field talking to people who, may have never met a reporter before, I have to be really explicit about what it means to talk to me, how I want to, use their story and my
mm,
story,
mhm,
decisions that we might have to make along the way.
mhm.
There's a lot there to think about.
And one of the issues in here that you talk about is how to get and keep homeless sources, individuals, who are there, a part of your story. I think one of the things that you have really excelled at, that I've seen you do at the highest level when I look at reporting on homelessness, is elevate individuals' experiences in a genuine way that reflects their complexity and reflects who they are. And then I've also seen you return and bring those individuals back into future stories. And so, we can talk more about the beat reporting guide as you'd like, um, but I'd just love to get your thoughts on how that experience has been for you to work with individuals who have been unsheltered, who've been on the streets. You've seen them succeed in overcoming homelessness. You've seen the whole spectrum of experiences. Um, how has that informed your reporting, and how has that been for you as a reporter?
So it's interesting. I keep in touch with a lot of folks, and then there are other people that drop off a lot, and
Yeah.
that's one piece of this. I would say it's been really incredible
Mm,
because I think so often this is a group of people, and we're talking about homeless San Diegans who are underestimated by most people that they meet.
yeah.
People walk by them on the street and they think that guy doesn't really have much to offer. I get a chance to sit down next to that guy and ask him, "How'd you get here? What's your story?" And I often find that people really want to help me when they figure out what I'm up to, and that there's an opportunity to talk to me and speak to a broader audience. And maybe, I often will say to people, after I talk to you, the mayor might know your name and he's going to hear your concern, because a lot of people feel just completely disenfranchised by their communities, that no one cares. And the process of keeping in touch, I mean, it really varies person to person. There are folks that I kept in touch with a lot for a period of time, and then they get housed or their situation changes and we lose touch. There are people that pop in and out. I have one gentleman that uh, kept in touch with during a series that I did on homeless hospital patients,
Mm.
and he just, like, now texts me life updates. Like, when he got housing, he
Yeah.
texted me a bunch of pictures,
That's awesome.
and after he finally got the heart surgery he'd been waiting for,
Mm.
he texted me and said, "I finally got the heart surgery." And then there are people that, I'm in pretty close touch with. I wrote about, Natalie Rashke and her family. During COVID, they had, become homeless and also then lost their RV, And I had done like a big story with Peggy Petey, who's an incredible photographer, about their experience. And the Rashke family ended up getting housed after we published the story. I actually was on the phone with Natalie yesterday,
Oh, cool.
just hearing about some of the advocacy that she's now doing since getting housed. She's really a huge advocate now. And she is now at risk of losing her emergency housing voucher that she got during COVID that
Yeah.
ultimately moved them off the street.
These are housing vouchers that came
Yes.
out during COVID. They were, sorry to interject, but basically, as many people know, the waiting list for a housing voucher, sometimes called Section 8 housing voucher, is really long, decade long for most families. A lot of them have been prioritized for individuals who are unsheltered in recent years, but even those full oversubscribed, they're not available. Amid COVID, there was some cash that came in from the federal government, and that was utilized to create these emergency housing vouchers for folks who had health conditions and other things that were related higher risk because of COVID. And it was a breath of fresh air and like genuine hope because we, the providers doing this work throughout the community, got so many people housed who just had been on these waiting lists, had no hope. And these are individuals who, by and large, are disabled, unable to fully support themselves through employment, or often have a lot of reasons why that's a big challenge for them. And so for this to be a lifeline to give them a place in was amazing. And the hope, the initial commitment, actually, not hope, the commitment from the federal government was that these vouchers would last for a set number of years. And the Trump administration has now said they're going to slash those and eliminate those. And so hundreds of people locally, thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of people nationally will lose their housing if this happens. And these are very vulnerable people. And so I'm continuously surprised to meet community members who don't understand or see the negative impact that are coming from the current administration and from other government cuts outside of the federal government, including at the state level. Obviously, cuts at city and county too. Like these cuts are real; they have a real impact, and they hurt people's lives. And the emergency housing vouchers that you mentioned are very likely going to go away, and people's lives will be destroyed as a result.
And I
So
think I would
yeah,
note about, then the city of San Diego, a lot of large families got housed with these vouchers.
yeah,
So
yeah.
Natalie has 4 kids
Mm,
and a husband, and they are all counting on that voucher. And Natalie is now, trying to look at every which way that she can advocate and
yep.
try to speak up. And so that was part of the reason we were talking yesterday, is she's trying to look at ways that she can speak up. I know she'd love to be on your podcast and speak about this as well.
We'd
So
love
I
to have her.
recommend her as a guest.
Yeah, we'd love to have her on.
Yeah, but it's been so neat that her story has been one of the neatest ones to watch because I wrote about her family and she then was able to pick up the mic herself.
Yeah,
And literally after that story first ran, she testified at the city council at the invitation of the council president and has continued to be an advocate who shows up at city and county meetings on the regular to speak about issues, including this one.
wow. Yeah, that's real empowerment.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's that. Thank you for sharing that and for allowing me a chance to jump in on
of
the
course.
housing voucher issue. Um, the homelessness reporting guide, we'll have a link in the show notes for our listeners. It's also super user friendly. There's great visuals in here. It's
Drawings by
summarized.
Blake Nelson, I might add.
Yeah, local, also
San Diego
homelessness
Union
reporting
Tribune
Tribune,
reporter. Yeah.
who is a fantastic artist. It turns out, a visual artist. Yeah, so check it out. Highly recommend it. Anything else you want to share about the reporting guide?
I would just say share it out. If you
Oh yeah,
find it helpful, please share it, because you never know who it might somehow help. And yeah, I'm very proud of the work we did on it. And I hope it can help result in better reporting and also better outcomes for the homeless people that are being reported on.
yeah. Well, again, it's the genesis in part behind this is why this show exists, and it is to educate the community. It's to connect with individuals, and it's to help the larger community understand the realities of homelessness and the strength of the people experiencing it. And overcoming it. So thank you for that. We wanted to spend the rest of the time that we have together, because you do so much work throughout the San Diego community around homelessness, um, checking in on a few trends. Within the last year, we're recording this in the summer of 2025. Within the last year, one of those trends has been a significant increase in enforcement and what I would call criminalization of individuals being homeless. It was about a year ago that the Supreme Court ruled that individuals could be ticketed for sleeping outside, could be um, re- receive criminal uh, actions as a result of simply being homeless.
With
This
that, and even if there's not shelter available.
without there having to be commensurate shelter
Mhm.
available. Thank you. The state of California similarly issued a ban on encampments about a year ago. Governor Newsom had a photo event down here in San Diego, throwing tents into trash cans, demonstrating enforcement as an issue. Almost every local city now has a camping ban or some sort of ban against being unsheltered, either in total or in particular areas. So all of this has been well, and so that those are the policy changes around encampment bans. Then in fall of last year, voters here and throughout the state overwhelmingly approved Prop 36 to reintroduce criminal measures around drug and theft issues, which had previously been decriminalized. And you wrote a story recently about sharing some initial data on the implementation of Prop 36, which we're going to talk about. But before we get into the Prop 36 piece, just at that higher level, like, it's been more than a year now of this very new environment of much more enforcement. What are you seeing? What are you reporting on? And what do you think our listeners would find interesting from what you've seen?
So I have focused most on the city of San Diego. That will be shifting. My focus is going to be broadening on a lot of these issues coming up here, but I focused a lot on the city, and I think that's important to
Yeah.
say up front. So I've been focusing most on the data that I have in the city of San Diego and what that tells me. In the city of San Diego, they passed a camping ban actually a year before the Grants Pass decision that you referenced.
Mm,
And so I have looked at the data before and after, and what I found that was that citations and arrests more than doubled in the 6 months after the Grants Pass decision. And this wasn't just related to the camping ban. This was also, longstanding ordinances that the city has used to address homelessness. And what I found spending some time really digging into that, talking to people, literally hiking into a marsh to talk to somebody, is really that this has challenged often efforts to help people. Often people are getting disconnected with service providers or advocates or just neighbors who are trying to help, whether those neighbors are homeless or housed. And, certainly homelessness seems less visible in certain areas, but I think a lot of your listeners would note that there are people that are popping up along freeways more and more, or other areas where maybe there weren't a lot of folks prior. And some of those areas are less safe. Obviously, close to a freeway, if you're having to cross the freeway to get anywhere, that's pretty unsafe. But I'm also seeing people literally, for example, I met a man named Micah. His path case manager hiked with me into a marsh to find him. He's since moved, but he had moved even just when I had first met him. He said this was his second move, like within the area. So he'd been moving around and I'm asking him, Micah, have you ever fallen? Like, it was actually kinda hard to get in here,
yeah.
there was some
Yeah.
unsteady ground, and he's
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
"Oh, yeah. Yeah." So, sometimes people are ending up in areas that are less safe. He had actually also lost touch for a time with his case manager,
Sure.
and, um, what's interesting about this too is that though the number of shelter beds has been increasing in some communities, like the city of San Diego and Mayor Todd Gloria have been talking about, increased shelter opportunities, even despite this ruling. there's rarely enough shelter available, if ever enough shelter available for all who want it. And so the individuals that I've talked to, many have said, I actually accepted shelter and it wasn't available and I got cited still. Um, or maybe they're interested, but they, needed certain things to line up and we couldn't line it up in time to avoid the citation or the arrest. And so it just also makes it more challenging for the providers when it comes time that they're wanting to house folks. And I'm sure you could speak to this, Greg, that, okay, now this person has all these citations and arrests on their record. And then when you take that person to talk to a landlord, the landlord's like, what's going on with all this criminal history you've
Yeah,
got,
yeah,
right?
absolutely.
And so that is a process that, seeing all those things, the service providers will then go to try to take the person to homeless court and clear all of these cases. And that's a process. So that's another like multiple boxes often to check to help somebody actually move into housing, which everybody would say is the ultimate goal.
And in addition to shelters not being not for the in addition to the fact that there aren't enough shelters for the amount of people who would like to get off the streets, shelter is often not the best intervention. Where does somebody put all their stuff? Does the shelter allow for them and their partner to enter? What about their pet, the one creature who's not judging them every day, right? So, you know, um, we've had some initial success with a state-funded encampment resolution fund program in Oceanside and Carlsbad. One of the reasons has been that we're utilizing shelter, but we're also getting people directly into housing really quickly, and utilizing funds to work with landlords to secure units and then get people moved in. And all of these issues can be overcome in that way, but they are huge issues. The citations, the tickets, what I was talking about, possessions, what your household looks like. Um, there are ways to overcome those, but a lot of these enforcement challenges just make that much more difficult.
When I feel like I need to do a quick plug, if folks haven't heard about the Encampment Resolution Grant progress and want to hear more about that, my colleague Tigus Lane did a wonderful story looking at the success of that thus far. So let's link that out too.
Yeah, we'll put that in the show notes. She did a really wonderful story there. And then she's also done two stories, personal stories about a family who we've worked with, which are among the best personal narratives that I've seen shared about the challenges. And this is a family who came to interfaith when they were um, mom and dad and their three kids, unfortunately living in the back of a U-Haul truck because that was the cheapest option that they could afford, cheaper than a rental car. Um, and they've had quite a journey. They're now housed and doing well nearby here in San Marcos. But Tigus did a wonderful job sharing their journey over a couple stories. So we'll link to that as well. As we think about going back to this trend around increased enforcement, you talked about how people move around. It's harder to connect with people. Obviously, there are these challenges physically when people have to move. They get disconnected from their resources. Um, what other outcomes or what other trends around enforcement have you reported on that you'd like to share?
I think it's been interesting, looking at what's been happening since grants pass,
Mm,
right? And also talking to the police department and city of San Diego
yeah.
about this. And they're adamant that they did not increase enforcement as a result of the grants pass decision, but that their new police chief, Scott Wall, who actually started the neighborhood policing division that's focused on homelessness and quality of life crimes, that he directed them to increase the size of the team that's focused on addressing those issues. And so that includes homeless outreach team workers and also folks that do more enforcement. So what they've been doing is having now every new officer that comes out of the academy is part of this team, the neighborhood policing division, doing this enforcement. And there's actually in the last 6 months, interestingly, at least by numbers, enforcement is down a bit. And they say that that's because the latest academy class was a little bit smaller than the prior one. So the police, it's
Hmm.
interesting. They feel like they're trying to offer shelter and help, and have a, really, when they talk about this, when I have these conversations with them that you and I are having, they're, emphasizing accountability and, will we always offer help? And some people take it. And I think like I reflect on that here because I think it's important to note that everyone does have a different story. And there are people, because sometimes we hear this story of, oh, well, this person interacted with the police and it turned their life around, right? There are people that that's the case, that, maybe they kept interacting with this one officer and finally they just put their hands up one day and said, I'm done dealing with you and you always citing me. I'm ready to go into shelter.
Hmm.
But for the vast majority of people that I've interacted with, the enforcement has just made life more challenging, which then makes moving off the street more challenging.
Yeah, and I want to be clear to our listeners. My perspective, and I'm not sure where you are on this, although you begin to speak a little bit to it, is not that there's no place for enforcement, and certainly that there's no place for accountability. Accountability is paramount for a healthy society and for healthy individuals. Um, but where we are within our organization at Interfaith Community Services is that we can't start talking about, like, I would say, air quote, accountability for somebody when the system that they're trying to access is not available, when the shelter's not available, when the housing isn't available. And so until there is accessibility, until people can actually get into these resources, we don't think it's appropriate to really be hammering them for not being able to access the things that aren't available. And so we really lean into that accessibility and equitability of access to things, as a way to give people an opportunity to legitimately be accountable. If they have an opportunity to access housing and shelter, well, then we can talk about why they're accessing those things or not.
Well, and I think something that often gets lost, and I would say your listeners probably understand this, but
Yeah.
in the broader public, I think sometimes there's this thought, well, if I were homeless and a police officer walked up to me and offered shelter, well, that would definitely be better than what I've got, outside. So yeah, I'd take that in a second. What's wrong with this person? And I think what that perspective misses is that, for one, I'm going to say right now, if you walked up to me, I don't care who you are, and you offered me a place to stay, I would be pretty skeptical of you. And if you have a gun and a badge on, I might have some other reasons to be skeptical of your motivations, especially if, you happen to be in a community, or even personally, who somebody that has had negative experiences with law enforcement. But also, to your point, Greg, earlier, sometimes shelters aren't the right fit for folks, and I think often we're suggesting people should just accept anything. But if they can't bring their pet, or they have a health condition, maybe they have PTSD because they're a veteran and because of experiences that they had, serving overseas, that they just cannot be around that many people. And I say a lot, actually, I could never stay in a shelter. I am a very light sleeper. And if you're in a shelter with a bunch of people, a few people are probably going to be snoring and they would keep me up all night because I'm that light of a sleeper.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I think people often, like, it's hard to relate to that. But I think it's an important part of the conversation. Like, what would work for you? What do
Absolutely.
you need for this to work for you?
And I think I encourage people to put themselves in the shoes of the people experiencing it, and to not ask why aren't they accepting it. So don't start from a why don't you do this? Why I would do that. No, flip it around and say, I wonder why they're not accepting that. Like, I wonder why, like, be accountable to yourself and start asking those questions, like, gosh, I would take that, but they're not. Why is that? And there are all these really understandable reasons why, when we look at it from that person's perspective rather than um, appropriating our own onto theirs.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, and I find that that's, for me as a reporter, considering those sorts of things are really important. And
Yeah.
that goes for, both the homeless person that I meet on the street and also the officials that I'm questioning often, is to think about, why did they think that?
Hmm.
How did they get there?
Hmm.
And that often leads to the best conversations when we can really think about that.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, let's talk Prop 36.
Yeah.
So I talked a little bit about what it is, that it brought back enforcement measures, putting people into jail for drug offenses and thefts that had been decriminalized previously. Decriminalized previously in part because they were disproportionately impacting marginalized communities, people of color, historically disenfranchised people and communities, and the Prop 36 was brought forward and passed again overwhelmingly 68, 64%, something high percent of voters last year, with the idea that there would be this enforcement, there would be this stick if you did these things, but you'd have the offer of treatment, and you'd have a carrot and incentive out. So it'd be that positive opportunity for people who were um, facing bigger repercussions because of this new law. You shared a story, wrote a story recently on some of the initial data. You want to share with our listeners what you discovered?
Yeah, and just to set the scene a little bit more, one of the promises, as you said, of Prop 36 is that it'd really focus on repeat offenders,
Hmm.
people who've had multiple drug or theft cases, so 3 or more, and that there would be this mechanism that if somebody was willing to accept treatment, that they could avoid further prosecution and, move forward in their life, clean and sober and, employable, et cetera, right? And so a lot of folks when proponents, including DA Summer Steffen, who was on your show recently, when they were promoting this, they were really selling this offer of treatment quite a bit. Um, and meanwhile, opponents were very concerned, as you pointed out, that marginalized communities would be hit harder and that there wouldn't be treatment available. So I wanted to take a look at how is this going so far. And I started with the city of San Diego just because I do some pretty regular records requests with the city of San Diego that allow me to track this. And what I found in early May, first off, when I asked the question of how many people are actually getting treatment, um, the district attorney's office told me at the time that they had filed more than 670 Proposition 36 cases that were eligible for treatment. So this is specifically drug-related cases. And so I wanted to know, okay, what's been the process to refer people to treatment? Because when I was pulling court records myself, I wasn't seeing a lot of folks get treatment. What they told me is that at that time in early May, 50 defendants had been referred to treatment. I'm going to kind of break that apart for a second so folks can understand what that means. Again, 670 folks who's had cases filed against them. 50 defendants were referred to treatment. Now, Greg's nodding, and I know what he's thinking is a referral does not mean getting it.
No.
And so, one thing that I really want to track from there is okay, how many people actually get treatment? And how are they treated once they go through that treatment? And what happens if somebody relapses through that process? Now, obviously that was a pretty low number. And I had some questions even before getting that number of how are people being connected with treatment? What I found is that it took the county 4 months after this law took effect to come up with the process to link people with treatment. So folks are going through this process. Hundreds of people are being arrested. And, still, there wasn't actually this mechanism that had been promised to voters. And the county said, we're working as quickly as we can. We're, trying to set up this process. We need to make sure we have people to do the work. I would question, and I did, well, couldn't you have seen this coming? I didn't really get a great answer.
And it sadly echoes what precipitated Prop 36, which was Prop 47, which was the decriminalization of these drug and theft offenses. And the promise was that it would reduce prison population, would save government money, and that money would be used instead to offer treatment. And I was in the role that I'm in with Interfaith now, when this all went down a little over a decade ago. And I remember that it passed, and then it was maybe a year and a half later when the funding began to flow to local governments, and then they have to then go through their process to put the money out. And our San Diego County contracts with a lot of these services. They contract with Interfaith Community Services for these services, as one example. Anyways, it took time for it to happen, and then once it happened, it was like, I would say, if I was the person who wrote that legislation, I'd be embarrassed at how minimal the resource was. We're talking dozens of residential beds for, hundreds and hundreds of people who were no longer being criminalized for this activity, but there was no additional treatment resource. And so that didn't work, right? Which then led to saying, okay, well, now we're going to go the other way and go back to criminalizing, but same thing. We're going to provide resources, and it's very disheartening, and it's very sad to see that those resources, at least from your initial reporting, are really not there yet.
Well, and another thing that, came up among proponents when they were pushing for this new state law is they were saying, well, Proposition 1 is going to help. Now, Proposition 1, I know you're very familiar with Proposition 1, but Proposition 1 was a ballot measure that passed last March, and was meant to provide more funding for behavioral health and kind of rejigger the Mental Health Services Act at the state, that millionaire's tax that some of you might be familiar with, that was supposed to help fund mental health services. But that money isn't dropping immediately, as we both know, and it wasn't designed for Prop 36. It was designed for a broader need for behavioral health services.
For
I'd be
behavioral health,
interested to hear more about
yeah, I
what you
mean,
think about that.
Prop 1 is really devoted to behavioral health infrastructure,
Yes.
creating more beds, creating more outpatient slots, as they call it, places where you don't necessarily need a bed, but you're going for daytime services and treatment services or evening services. And it also goes beyond drug and alcohol addiction. It's behavioral health based. So it's also psychiatric beds. It's also crisis stabilization, kind of 23 and a half hour places for people to go. So a real broad spectrum of behavioral health infrastructure, which is urgently needed. And that Prop 1 is going to make a significant impact. One of the biggest reasons why is because it actually takes the zoning approval away from the local government. And if the state funds a Prop 1 project, the local city or county or municipality cannot say, no, you can't put that here. And that zoning approval is one of the biggest impediments to actually citing and opening these things. So just that change actually makes a big impact in creating more of these behavioral health beds and resources. The funding makes a big impact too, but it's almost all been allocated at this point. There was a round one that was announced, and I think there are about 5 projects here in San Diego, some really good projects that will open up, including some drug and alcohol beds, detox, and residential treatment, which will be great. Those won't open though this year. Maybe some will open next year in 2026, but it's a longer process. And in the meantime, to the point of your reporting, hundreds of people are being arrested and I would imagine receiving jail sentences without the commensurate opportunity for additional treatment, because the treatment capacity as it exists now in our county is full. There are not untold number of empty available treatment beds for people who are seeking them.
hmm The other data point that I think is really important to talk about, is just a key disparity that became very clear to me, even just starting to pull court records. I started noticing when I was pulling court records for the story about treatment access,
Yeah.
um, that I was just seeing a lot of Black San Diegans, a very disproportionate number. And so I decided, okay, I'm going to get that spreadsheet out and I'm going to do some analysis. And with the help of 2 excellent interns, Alina and Tessa, we did some analysis and we found that about a third of the arrests, rather of the people that were arrested for Prop 36 related charges in the city of San Diego in its initial months were Black. Black people make up just 6% of the city's population. So when we're talking about 32% versus 6%, that is a big disparity. And a lot of folks who are opposed to Prop 36 were very concerned that this would be an outcome when the campaign was going on. And so now talking to some of those folks, they're just really disappointed and sad that what they were saying they were concerned would happen is already happening.
And to be really clear, that is the when you see a third of people being arrested who are black compared to 6% of the larger population, that is the result of systemic racism. That's the result of a lot of types of racism, but absolutely systemic racism. Now, you can argue, is it systemic racism among the people doing the arresting now? That's a bigger conversation, but it cannot be argued that it is not the result of previous and existing inequalities and systemic forms of racism. So, in order to address that, we need anti-racism. We need to very proactively think about policies that break down these systems of inequalities. And the problem is Prop 36 does not have that proactive lens. It doesn't have that, gosh, okay, this, we don't want to have people out there using substances or committing crimes, not having any negative outcome, not having any punishment for that. We want to provide access to treatment and have this balance. Okay, but it needs to be done with the idea that, hey, but in our current system, we're way over criminalizing this one group of people. So how can we bring forward what could be argued as a more just set of enforcement and resources in a way that is truly equitable and person centered to overcome these systemic problems that we have.
Well, and speaking of systemic problems, I thought, it was interesting. Of course, I asked San Diego police, what say you about
Yeah,
this?
yeah,
This is pretty stark.
yeah.
And I'm going to look at my notes to share some of what they said, but they noted that there were a disproportionate number of arrests that were happening in downtown San Diego. And specifically, they noted that downtown San Diego is home to a homeless population that is disproportionately Black. This was one of the things that they immediately called out. And so we did some additional data analysis on that. And what they were saying bore out, in terms of the disparities there. But they, just really emphasized that like there is this, while they can't be certain about all of this anecdotally, they see a correlation with homelessness. And so that's where this connection is, and something that I really hope to follow more in the months to come is, this was sold in part as a homelessness measure as well, which a lot of folks were critical about. But there was a suggestion that, well, this will help address homelessness too. Um, so one thing I would really like to do is take a look at how many can we correlate this with homelessness and where some of this enforcement is happening at a deeper level, because certainly it bore out in downtown San Diego from our early analysis.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and just to reiterate and kind of provide more background, homeless unsheltered individuals, the population of unsheltered individuals, people of color are disproportionately represented there as well, which is what they're saying. Like, hey, we were in downtown San Diego. This was targeted at the unsheltered community, of which Black San Diegans are very overrepresented compared to the larger population. And the same dynamics exist with other other ethnicities and other communities as well, where you see overrepresentations. Um, the that is the result of historic systemic inequalities, and there's mountains of data showing that the number one predictor of homelessness is the level of economic depravity in the community that the individual's in. So if you're in a community where everyone is financially distressed, you're much more likely to end up homeless. And of course, our country has built those communities with a lot of problematic policies, right? So the point of it all is that when we target something that is going to address a unsheltered community, we need to realize that that is going to disproportionately impact people of color. And if we're going to do that in a way that increases enforcement and criminal outcomes, I'm not a civil rights attorney, but that does seem to violate the Civil Rights Act that like says that you cannot do things that disproportionately impact one race over another. So I think that there's just a lot of opportunities for advocates and for the community to really look at these issues, from these different perspectives. And I really appreciate your reporting, and I think we have a lot of work to do as a community on all of the strategies that we're bringing forward to help people overcome homelessness because they can have very unintended outcomes if we don't take into consideration the nature of the demographics of the populations we're working with here.
Well, and I think, we should note too that the district attorney, I asked her about this. You've had a conversation with her as well, and she says she wants to track the data. So I'm going to hold her to that. I'm going to be checking in and asking, okay, what is the data telling us about, who is being affected by this, and also, are they getting treatment?
Yeah, yeah, and she was just on our show, and we talked a little bit about this, but it wasn't the primary focus. But she said she wants to come back with more data, with more information. So I'm really looking forward to having more of those conversations. We're gonna wrap up today. We always do calls to action as we end, and so I'm gonna segue into my call to action, which is that, and I'm gonna preface it by saying the issues that I've been talking about the last few minutes around the inherent connections between racism of all types, inequities, and homelessness, they require that we as a larger community be educated on these issues because Prop 36 wasn't created by the district attorney. Prop 36 wasn't created by police departments. They're the ones enforcing it and implementing it, but it was created by our legislative process. It was approved by our voters, and so we need a community that really goes beyond the headlines and really gets to know the complexities of the issues that we're talking about. And I think our listeners are 100% in that group. I mean, they're however many minutes into a podcast on homelessness at this point, right? But my call to action for our listeners is to share either this episode or other episodes or the homelessness reporting guide that you've created, Lisa. Share these more comprehensive, thoughtful analyses with others who care. Bring them up in conversation, and let's continue to become more and more educated as a community. Because without that, we're just going to continue to pass policies that sound logical and make sense on the face of it, but when you dive in, ultimately could end up making things worse.
Do I get a call to action too?
Yeah, you get it.
Okay.
Absolutely.
So I'll be slightly selfish with this one. I think that it's so important for folks to take the time to take in local news.
Hmm.
I'm having more and more conversations, even with friends and family members who care a lot about their communities, who just aren't keeping up as much on local news these days. And what I tell them is local issues are where you can have more of an impact. I know a lot of folks are feeling very overwhelmed right now about what's happening nationally. But at a local level, you can have an impact on both local and like local implementation of national issues.
Yeah.
And so, whether we're talking about something like implementation of Prop 36, or even the implementation of the Big Beautiful Bill, you can keep up with what's going on via local news. And then that gives you the tools potentially to, if you do go to a community meeting and talk, or you do have an opportunity to meet with a council member or something, you're going into that meeting informed. And also, you could use that to decide where you want to focus your advocacy or volunteerism. Maybe you learn about, for example, the cuts that food banks are very concerned about, and you decide that maybe you want to put more of your donations toward food banks this year, or you want to actually get involved with a food drive or something in your community. Really, I've been engaging a lot with local journalists even more this past year than in
Mm,
normal years just because of some projects I've been working on. And what I find is, yeah, I mean, all of us care so deeply about our communities and see ourselves as part of the process for you all to know what's going on. And we need your support too to keep doing what we're doing. And something as simple as just reading and sharing a story can be huge.
it's a great call to action, absolutely, and they really play off each other, right? Becoming more educated around homelessness and these issues, and everything we experience is local. And couldn't agree with you more that we have a better opportunity to influence those local politics and those local issues than we do at the national level for sure. So I will add on to your call to action and encourage our listeners to follow and sign up for the Voice of San Diego, a morning report that comes out every weekday. It's excellent. It's one of the first things I read every day. And also to support the Voice of San Diego, which is a nonprofit news organization. I happen to privately be a donor, so I support myself. But just the work that you all are doing is so important, especially in a landscape where there's just a lot less media coverage of local politics.
Well, thank you for your support, Greg. And I appreciate the call out. My bosses probably appreciate that too.
Well, thank you for taking the time to join us, Lisa. We'll see if this episode gets more viewers than the last one. I'm sure it's going to be very popular. You're such a light of information and education on these critical issues. So, very much appreciate you taking the time to join us. Thank you to our listeners for being a part of what we're doing. Definitely check out the Homelessness Reporting Guide, the other resources we linked. Anything else you want to share before we wrap up, Lisa?
Well, my beat is going to be broadening a little bit
Oh,
coming
okay.
up, and I am going to be focusing more on the entire county,
Okay.
meaning I am focused on county government. So I'm very open to questions and suggestions um, about homelessness, behavioral health, and other issues that the county government is responsible for.
Well, and so absolutely to listeners about the paying attention to local issues, pay attention to to our local county government. That is, I believe, the most impactful local government on our day to day lives, and it often goes without a lot of notice or attention. So yeah, local county government. Well, that's great that your beat is expanding to that. Thank you again for joining us, and to our listeners, thank you for being a part of what we're doing. We will talk to you again soon.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Lisa.